Okay, good morning. Thank you so much for your patience. So unfortunately, there was some issue with my pad. Since Monday, I could not log in on my pad. I mean, when I say log in, just log in the Zoom. And then so I have to click the link like you guys click, and then automatically, so the Zoom is going to mute me. So that's why sometimes you cannot hear me. All right. Before I start today's class, let's see. Do we have anything to say? Not really. I just wondering. So, have you guys watched the debate last night? Not really. Okay. I guess it's important to watch. So they haven't talked too much about the economy yet, but I see. Yeah. So sorry. So they did have a section to talk about the economy. Like, say, for example, talk about the job market, talk about economic growth. That part is quite relevant to us, so you may want to check it out. All right, so let's continue our discussion. So these slides kind of summarize what we discussed on Monday. So where we are trying to understand how to measure in the economy, right? So when I say measuring the economy, so here, so basically we focus on GDP. And then the GDP is going to be used to measuring the economic activity, right? But as we learned so far, so the economy is so complicated, right? And there are so many different business, so many different economic activities. So we must take a simplification regarding to the real economy so that we can understand also that we can measure. The way we start from simple, right? So we start with two agents or two party in the economy. One is a household, the other is a firm. So they interact on two different markets. One is goods and service, the other is factor market, right? And then so we quickly make this model more realistic, but essentially making it more complicated to capture how the real economy works, right? All right. So before we have government, so you can see there's a closed loop. So you can look at the GDP, or we can measuring the economic activity through three different channels. Number one, we look at the production, right? So that just gives you the definition of GDP. And secondly, we can look at spending. And the third, we can look at income. So here is income, right? So these three approaches should give you the same thing because this is a closed loop, right? And then, so next we add government. Okay, government collect tax and then provide transfer and purchase goods and service, right? And so government may run deficit or surplus, and then so the deficit or surplus is going to channel through the financial market, right? So this financial market will be used not only by government, also by firms. Firms sometimes they may want to borrow so they can expand their business for the future, right? And so that's going to happen or show up as investment spending, right? And then lastly, we open the economy. So we have a rest of the world, right? So because of the comparative advantage, as we discussed earlier. And then so we have import and export, right? So import and export not always equal to each other, right? So if they equal to each other, that's fine. So we just export goods, and then we get foreign currencies. And then so we use foreign currencies to import goods and the service we cannot produce, right? So if that's the case, that's fine. But in most cases, they are not equal to each other. Like US is running trade deficit, meaning we import more than we export. So meaning so we do not have enough foreign currency to pay for the goods we imported. And then so we must borrow in the international financial market, right? So this borrowing happens through foreign lending, right? Or purchase of stocks. So basically foreigners purchase American stocks. So that literally translates into capital inflow. So this capital inflow will be used to pay for the extra import we have, right? So that closes the model, right? And then so we have run through those concepts. Where we left last class, right? So we discussed this definition, GDP, right? So among this definition of GDP, there are a couple of things. First is market value of final goods. And secondly is produced within a country and in a year. Oh, sorry. So this market is the first thing, and the final is the second thing, and within the country is the third thing, right? And we have explained them one by one, right? And here I just summarize what we discussed by looking at this circular flow diagram. So there are three ways to look at GDP. They all should give you the same number, right? Now here, just explain to you why they equal to each other. Because any penny you spend becomes somebody else's income, right? And then inside of the definition of GDP, we want to pay attention to the following things. GDP measures production, right? Sales of user goods or financial assets, they are not considered as new production. However, I want to emphasize the financial professionals or the sales agent for the house, they provide service so that the transaction went through. So actually their economic activity is counted as GDP. More specifically, think about someone works for Berkshire Hathaway, and this individual sell 10 houses, and all those houses are old house, not new build, right? So the housing value, the housing value that show up in the transaction is not part of GDP. But however, so this agent who provide service, right, then there's a charge. So those charge considered as GDP. And similarly, so if you bought some stocks through TD Ameritrade, the stock itself doesn't count as GDP. But however, so you may pay a small fee to TD Ameritrade. So that fee will show up as GDP because that's the service we produced in the current period, right? And then so it must be within a country. This is a geographical notion. GDP is a geographical notion, right? So here we have two examples to show you how we treat GDP, right? Now let's look at this practice question. Are the following included in the US GDP? One, the price paid by a German tourist when staying at a New York hotel. B, the price paid by American tourists when staying at a Berlin hotel. Start with the first one. Okay, so this economic transaction was happening in the United States, right? Because this is in a New York hotel. Okay, so in that sense, it must include in the US GDP. Now, in the second case, because the economic activity happens in Berlin, outside of the United States, hence it will not included in the US GDP, right? So the answer is C. Okay. And finally, so GDP typically is considered in a year, but in reality, so we also look at quarterly GDP, monthly GDP. As I mentioned last class, so we measuring the quarterly GDP of the US economy. In the second quarter of 2020, the GDP declined by 30%. Okay? But this 30% is only for one quarter. So that translates into 9% of decline for an annual GDP, right? Because there are 4 quarters, right? So if you click the link here, so maybe I can click it for now. So this goes to the government agency, which is the Bureau of Economic Analysis. So that's the government agency who is responsible to calculate the GDP. Look at most recent data, right? So they say real GDP, look at here. So real GDP decreased at an annual rate of 31% in the second quarter of 2020, right? Okay, now let's back to our slides. So here is summarize what is in and what is out. What is included? Domestically produced final goods and service, including capital goods, new construction of structures, and a change to inventory. Right? What does changes in inventory means? Here, give the example. Say Apple, they produce 5 million. They produce 5 million iPhones. They only sold 4 million. They have 1 million iPhone left. They are going to add into their storage. Okay, these 1 million considered as inventory. And this 1 million also increase inventory. This increase in inventory is going to consider as GDP. Right? So not is which are not included, intermediate goods and the service. So in the following slides, I'm going to explain to you what does intermediate goods means. So essentially, intermediate goods and service is the goods and the service we use to produce other things. Right? So we will have the slides to explain that. Input is not included. Used goods, financial assets, they are not included. Finally, goods and service produced outside this country are not included. Even those goods and services are produced by American. All right. Okay, so GDP may not be a perfect measure. This is because GDP means some important items we actually produce, we actually generate, right? So like this background picture shows, in a typical household, there are many economic activity has not been kept track of, right? So if you know my son, so he mow our lawn, I pay him $20. So this $20 actually reflects the economic activity he's performing, right? But so this hasn't been counted into our GDP, right? Or during the weekend, so I may just fix my car, right? And so this economic activity hasn't been officially recorded either, right? So in that sense, so the GDP number may be under-report. Furthermore, think about those underground economy, like illegal transaction, right? So pretty much none of them has been officially recorded. Okay, so in that sense, so the GDP number underestimate the actual economic activity. Now, I'm going to explain to you intermediate goods versus final goods, right? And so the way I explain that is maybe just through different method of calculating GDP. Okay, so here, so we can look at value added, right? But this value added, so essentially, is going to link to the product approach. So just remind yourself when I explain to you the circular flow diagram. So one approach we look at GDP is look at the summation of production, right? But in terms of production, so we must differentiate between final goods and intermediate goods. That's here, right? Because in the earlier circular flow diagram, right? So the model or the economy is so simple. There's no difference between intermediate goods and final goods. Pretty much everything will be consumed by final consumer, or in other words, in that circular flow diagram, so there's no intermediate goods. Now let's see what's intermediate goods and how that affect our calculation. Okay. So value added of a producer is the value of its sales minus its value of the purchase of intermediate goods and the service, right? So that's value added. In this background picture shows you what does value added means, right? So on the right hand side, so this garment, or this clothing is a final good. This sell to the final customer, right? So they have its market value, right? On the left-hand side, what do we need? We need those sheep skin or sheep wool. So that's the raw material. And then so we have value added, right? So this manufacturer, so they assemble, they do their job, and then they convert those raw material into final product. So that's value added, right? So and then when you calculate what this factory or what this manufacturer produced, we must separate or we must subtract the input they use, right? So in some sense, intermediate goods and service is similar to input. Okay? Now here we forward define final goods and service. Goods and service sold to final or end users, they consider final goods. Intermediate goods and service are goods and service that are input for production of final goods and service. Right? And give you an example. Just think about the monitor we use every day. Okay? So the monitor we use every day is going to produce by a brand. Say for example, so let's look at Dell. Right? So if the monitor produced by Dell is sold to a final users like us, and then so that monitor is considered as a final goods. On the other hand, if the monitor produced by Dell was sold to another company, let's say for example, say for example HP, right? So HP make computers, then so maybe so they need a monitors from Dell. If that's the case, this monitor becomes intermediate goods because its value is going to show up in HP's final products. So for example, a personal computer. Right? So that's the difference between final goods and the intermediate goods. So essentially, intermediate goods are input. Okay. Right. So to summarize, the reason why we want differentiate between final goods and intermediate goods is to avoid double accounting. Right. So we will have an example to show you how you may end up with double accounting, right? If you do not differentiate between final goods and the intermediate goods, right? Okay. All right. The second approach is going to be focused on spending. Right? So we can add up all spendings on domestically produced final goods and service. And in terms of spending, there are 4 categories. Right? First, we have consumer spending. This is C. And secondly, we have investment spending. This is I. Right? And the third, we have government spending. Right? Think about government purchase of goods and service. Right? And the lastly, we have net import. Sorry, net export, not net import. Right? So that is X minus IN. Or show over here, X minus IN. X is sales to foreigners. Okay, sales to foreigners, that is what we produce domestically, but consumed by foreigners. Okay, that's what we produce. But then we need to subtract import, right? Because at the same time, we purchase goods and service produced by foreigners. And there, so we subtract IM from X, that's going to give you the net good and service. That is going to be purchased by foreigners, right? So that add with C, I, and G, those four things all together will give us the total spending or total good and service we produce, right? So that's the second approach. But apparently, so you can also look at income approach, right? So income equal to your total spending, right? So now we can look at the US GDP by looking at value added versus spending, okay? So if we look at value added, so we can look at three different sectors. So value added by business on the bottom, and the value added by households in the middle, and finally value added by government. The biggest value added produced by government is national defense, right? So that they add up together equal to 100%. Okay. Now on the other hand, we can look at spending. Okay. First, you have consumer spending, and then so you have investment spending, government spending, and lastly we have net export. Okay, so we add them all together, so that's going to give you the total spending, right? So this total spending is going to equal to the value added, right? Okay, so now let me use this example to explain to you how to calculate GDP and why you may end up with double counting. Okay, start with the first approach, which is value added. Okay. But first, let me explain to you how this economy looks like. Right. So this is a very simple economy. In this economy, there are three businesses. First, American oil is the first business, and the second is we have American steel, and finally there's American motors. Right. And so in terms of each business, so the American oil, they produce raw materials, which is oil. These will be purchased by, look at how these things goes. So what they produced will be purchased by American steel. This show up here. So this 4,200 will be purchased by American steel. And American steel will use this raw material, iron ore, to produce steel. So American steel, they produce $9,000 value of steels. So these steels eventually will be purchased by American motors. Let's look at it, goes to here. Everything will be consumed by another business. And the American motors, so they are going to produce cars. The car valued at $21,500. And who is going to purchase this car? Certainly, they are going to be bought by consumer. So in that sense, cars, that is the only final good. Steel and oil, they are intermediate goods because they have been used as input. Now, oil has been used as input for steel, and steel has been used as input for car. Right? So now, given this discussion in mind, so now we can look at different approach. Start with value added. So here, so value added, we just add all together the value of production of final goods and service. Right? So now we look at each business. American oil, so their market, the sale of their goods is 4,200. Do they use anything as intermediate goods? Zero. So the value added equal to 4,200. That is coming from 4,200 minus zero. Let me write down here, 4,000 200 minus 0. American Steel, they produce $9,000 of steel, but they use 4,200 ohms as intermediate goods. That'll give you 4,800 of value added. And then lastly, we look at American Motors. So they produce 21,500. Then they use 9,000 as intermediate goods. So the value added is 12,500. Value added approach asks us to add them together. So that gives us the GDP. Now, so you add 4,200 plus 4,800 plus 12,500. That gives you 21,500. All right. Another way to look at the value added or final goods is, so as I just explained to you, the only final good in this economy is car. Look at here, right? So this, obviously, so another way to look at value added is just look at final goods, which give you 21,500. Okay, so this is the first approach. Now, second approach. Second approach is look at aggregate spending. Okay? And aggregate spending, so remember, so we have C plus I plus G plus NX. Here, there's no import and export. This goes to 0. No government, so G goes to 0. Investment, actually, there's no investment, so this goes to 0. We only have consumer spending. And here, consumer purchase a car. And the car is valued at 21,500. Hence, by looking at aggregate spending, so we end up with 21,500. But please differentiate from what I just mentioned when we look at value added. Let's go there, so I to look at final goods. It's in terms of production. Now, even though it's the same number. So this second approach. Now we can look at third approach, which is income. Okay. So we just look at income to all sorts of factors has been used in the economy. Right? So this includes wage income, that goes to labor, interest income, that goes to capital, rent, that goes to building or land. Finally, so you have profit. So that goes to the owner of the business. Because eventually those three businesses, they must owned by someone in the economy. Okay? So we calculate the income for these 4 different sources of factors. We add them together so that we end up with 21,500. Right? From this example, you can see the 3 different approaches, all of them must give us the same number. Right? So now we can look at another example. Okay? So this is a circular flow diagram as we have seen earlier. Right? Here we just simply put numbers. Now the question is how we can calculate GDP through these 3 different approaches as we just discussed. Okay? So I'm going to take a 5-minute break. During the break, please think about how we can calculate GDP through the approach we just discussed.